Hey everybody, it's your captain here with a Friday treat, and I'm coming at you today with something a little bit different. This is, for all intents and purposes, an isolated story. This one doesn't have any bearing on the Earth OCU universe, which I told you might happen sometimes because there are certain stories that I want to tell that just don't fit within the bounds of the Earth OCU universe. This one has to do with Avatar The Last Airbender and Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, which is really exciting for me because I wanted to work with both of these properties together at the same time, and I couldn't do that in the Earth OCU universe. As some of you might know, specifically those of you who have watched My Hero Academia Part 1 video, you know that I do use Avatar in my Earth OCU universe. I'm just making absolutely sure everybody knows that this is not connected to that. The main crux of this is what if there were two avatars at once, because that idea got put in my head a lot and I thought it would be extremely interesting. But also, to tie this in with Full Metal, what if Edward Elric were transported into Avatar? This partially comes from a fanfiction I read a little while back called Intersecting Points, which I believe has been discontinued, which is a darn shame. Also, so the others can interact with Ed a bit better, I'm aging them up a few years and Korra down a little bit. Trust me, it's not going to mean much in the long run. So, with that said, kick back, relax, and grab a treat. Hopefully, you're in for one. The Avatar Cycle. Most knew it well. Ever since the beginning of bending as an institution, there would be two individuals born with the power to control all four elements. Through some element of fate, they would always be born within a few years of one another. Partners who went through the roughest stages of life together. Simply being around one another brought strength, including the so-called Avatar state, a monstrous, nigh unstoppable form that was impossible for either of them to utilize without the aid of another. Which was why the last Fire Lord, Sozin, made sure to kill the last two avatars, Roku and Kyoshi, when they weren't close to each other. Sozin's attempt to ensure that there would be no next generation of avatars failed, at least as far as he knew. He had to wage a complete war of extermination against two different groups at the same time, and while one was known for their pacifism, the other had a litany of great warriors behind them. He managed to wipe the airbenders off the face of the earth, but the best he could do with the waterbenders was ensure that none would exist in the southern tribe, not being able to break past the northern wall. Even that in itself was a feat, with the north trying its best to protect its sister kingdom, knowing that the Avatar could be born there someday. Unbeknownst to Sozin, who also held fear in his heart, this new threat would never come to be. Because while the Avatar of the air nomads, the young Aang, would be born and lost to sea, his partner's birth was mysteriously absent. As though fate itself knew that she wouldn't be needed yet. That was until 86 years after Aang was frozen, 86 years after the fall of the air nomads and the slaughter of every known waterbender in the southern tribe. A young Korra would take her first breath. As she grew in the northern tribe, taking her first steps, drawing her first string of water with her movements, everybody knew that the girl was a prodigy. But it was when she spit her first burst of fire that people began to truly take notice. Northern society was particularly sexist when it came to the roles waterbenders were meant to take, something that came to a head when they realized that a girl was the mighty Avatar. They weren't stupid, they knew they had to train her, but there was always some form of hesitation there, like they refused to give her everything, despite how important she was. And she knew she was important. The Fire Nation came knocking on the North's door every couple of years on the off chance that something like her finally showed up. She was their secret weapon, the turning point that could end all of this, and nothing was coming of it. Even her parents, as much as she loved them, were careful not to let her go too far, careful not to let her make too big of an impression, for fear of losing her, and that just wasn't sitting well with her. She was supposed to be traveling the world, having adventures, training, and if she wasn't going to get what she needed at home, then she was going to get it from somewhere else. She was the Avatar after all. Everybody back home would just have to deal with it. On the eve of the girl's 13th birthday, she unknowingly followed the footsteps of her other half, leaving her home not out of fear of being the Avatar, but excitement to see what it meant. She would travel to the outskirts of the Earth Kingdom, picking up the most basics of the art of earthbending as she traveled, never being particularly subtle with her other skills. This style, traveling the world without a single attachment to her name, actually worked for a little bit, helping the occasional straggler every now and then, fighting off the Fire Nation as well as her self-taught skills could allow, even picking up some of the bare minimum of firebending from a few run-ins that she had with the so-called shellheads of the Fire Nation's military. It was nice, until the day her luck ran out. She encountered a boy, Zuko. a firebender in command of his own army, once sworn to find and capture both halves of the Avatar to ensure the restoration of his honor. She'd been better than so many of the benders she encountered. Her unconventional thinking had kept her steps ahead from the rabble for nearly a year on her solo journey. But him? He was a master. She was a dabbler in 3 elements, but she was a master of none of them. Every single flaw in her technique, no matter how small it might have seemed, he exploited with ruthless efficiency. Their fight was long, but it only ended one way. With the girl in chains, captured on the boat she had come to know as Zuko's ship, there she would remain for months, until the fate of her world would change forever, when a boy would be discovered in ice, and another boy would appear in a flash of light. Ed looked around, and there was nothing. Nothing but blank space. He hadn't expected using Envy's stone to escape Gluttony's pocket universe to bring him back here, the last place he ever wanted to see again. You've made quite a mess of things, Edward Elric. You used too much power from the stone, far too much, the voice of the white blob of a child said, echoing in Ed's ear. Ed looked at Truth. Had he? He had never used a Philosopher's Stone before. Any power from something so demonic seemed like too much, and it was the first time he was trying to purposely travel through dimensions. Okay, what the hell does that even mean? Ed asked. It means the checkbook must be balanced. For a moment, it looked like the universe itself had split for Ed, like he was seeing double, before everything went black. The next thing he noticed, he was standing in the middle of a normal town. Well, not normal, it was pretty unfamiliar. Where the fuck am I? He asked, more to himself than anyone around him. And there were people around him. An entire city of people who looked confused, to say the least, at the boy just appearing in an eruption of light. Ed's confusion was much, much worse, though, especially when it erupted into panic. Ow, he rubbed his temple. His brother was nowhere in sight. Ow! He shouted, shoving people aside, looking for the man. The nearly 8-foot lunk of armor that he knew his brother as. Ed grabbed a man by the arm as he walked by him, pulling him inches from his face. Hey, asshat, I'm a state alchemist, Ed said, pulling his watch from his side, flashing it like a badge. What? The man asked, scared. Ed flinched. Even another country would know the dogs of Amestris' military. Didn't exactly bode well for him, but he couldn't bother to care about the semantics of the whole situation. It doesn't matter. Just know I outrank you. You seen a guy like 7 feet tall in a suit of armor somewhere? He asked, the man slowly shaking his head. Ed took a deep breath. So, Al wasn't here. That was fine. He could always find Envy and then pound him back into taking him where he was supposed to be. But that led to another problem, and presumably a much bigger one. Envy could look like literally anyone on Earth. I don't suppose you've seen some guy with long black hair around here? Tiny shirt, short pants, crazy-ass eyes? Or a giant green monster? Ed asked, knowing it wasn't exactly likely that he was going to be taking his monstrous form around here. When the man shook his head, Ed couldn't exactly hide his disappointment. Fuck! He slammed his automail arm into the wall behind the man, who shrunk in response. Ed took a second to collect himself. Where the hell am I? He muttered to himself, thankfully loud enough for the man in front of him. Gowling, the man replied shakily. Huh? Ed replied. The Earth Kingdom, the man swallowed hard. Huh? Ed said again. The Earth Kingdom? Ed knew every country even remotely close to Amestris. It was part of the training he had to go through as a state alchemist to know the world, especially since half of them were his country's enemies. To say none of this made sense would be the understatement of all understatements. Ed felt a hand on his shoulder, which he pulled away with ease. Some guy dressed in all green clothes. Sir, you're causing a public disturbance, the man said, Ed looking him up and down before letting the man in his fist grasp go. Oh, right. My bad, Ed replied. He began to walk away, only for the green-clad man to grab him on the arm, and for him to twist out of the grip, again, easily. Buddy, I am having a very bad day. You do not want to take this any further, Ed said, cracking his knuckles. With respect, sir, your behavior has been nothing short of criminal. You're going to need to come with us, the man replied, stomping the ground with a wall of rock coming up in front of Ed, which he dodged immediately. No light from an alchemical reaction, no alchemic circle in general, The guy didn't even clap, the earth just moved with him. The same thing happened when he did it again, only for Ed to clap and turn the whole thing into dust. The guard stood in silence for a moment, staring at the boy before tackling him into the fountain. Ed clapped his hands, slamming them into the surface of the water. It twisted up, lifting the men into the air before freezing into an ice fist that restricted him. If people weren't nervous before, they sure were now. "Earth and water?" the guard murmured. That murmur soon spread to the entire crowd, becoming one steady, repetitive beat that pounded at his ears over and over again. "The Avatar." "I'm sorry, the what now?" Ed murmured to himself. People were surrounding him, getting closer. A couple of them looked even scared. And those guards look a heck of a lot more eager to get their hands on him now. Thinking quick, Ed clapped his hands together again, creating a mountain of steam from the water beneath him, obscuring his presence as he scampered away, the panic sounds of searching being heard behind him, hitting his ears as he ducked into an alleyway. Lots of complaints about something called the Fire Nation getting wind of his appearance, and probably coming down on the city. Fire Nation, Earth Kingdom, Avatar, what the hell is going on here? The waves of the ocean bobbed the ship up and down, as Prince Zuko of the Fire Nation let a small smile drift across his face for the first time in a very long time. Ignoring the pleas of his uncle, he went down to the basement of the ship to confirm his suspicions. There, sitting in chains in a corner that nobody had bothered to attend to, sat a young, brown-haired woman with dark skin. The blue eyes that she had that normally strained against the blackness that surrounded them were closed. Something that drew his attention. "Avatar," Zuko said, plainly. It wasn't a question in his mind anymore. It couldn't be. The young woman forced her face toward the floor. "Geez, you're still calling me that? I keep telling you this bending I was doing was a trick of the light," she said, her voice still jovial even after the weeks that she had been gathered here. Like she still wasn't taking things seriously. Like she still wasn't in danger. "You really don't know how to let things go, do you?" Zuko stared at the girl. Even now, she was a walking contradiction. When he found her, a firebender wearing earthbender clothing, using waterbending, she already stood out. And he was sure, positive, no matter what she said, that he saw her using earthbending, and maybe even a little firebending in their fight. Acts that she never replicated, that she never even came close to replicating again. Acts that he had almost convinced himself were just himself seeing tricks. Now, in a situation that should rightly terrify her, she was still as calm as she was every day. Every single day when he talked to her. "So, what brings you to my neck of the woods? I thought I wasn't pressing business anymore," she said, turning her head so that she could listen to his position. For some reason, Zuko noted, she seemed very reluctant to open her eyes. "Things have changed," Zuko replied as he walked directly next to her. "You think about what I had to say?" the girl responded. "Korra." "Oh, you're calling me by my name now, huh?" the 14-year-old joked. "If only you could give yourself the same respect you're trying to give me." "Don't start again," Zuko snarled. "Yeah, right. Don't disrespect the man who gave you an impossible task just to get rid of you," Korra responded. This wasn't the first time they had this conversation since she'd been captured. It was an easier conversation to have now. He didn't stop her when she said it anymore. He just stared. She imagined that was what he was doing right now. "Yeah, your dad's a real saint. I'm sure he checked up on you a lot since the last time we talked. After all, it's gotta be easy for the Fire Lord himself to do." Zuko didn't respond to those words. Rather, he knelt down beside her. "That task doesn't seem impossible now." "You still have no way of proving that I'm the Avatar in front of other people," Korra responded, a sentence that she had probably said 100 times now. "No, not without the other one," Zuko responded. "But I think you know that. Open your eyes." "I'm really tired right now," Korra responded, knowing quickly that it wouldn't end the conversation. "I don't want to hurt you," Zuko said. Korra almost shot back with a "coulda fooled me." After all, her capture was a particularly painful experience, but the more Korra saw of Zuko, the more she saw what was underneath that fiery warlord persona he tried so hard to craft. She saw that he was just a scared kid. She even tried to appeal to him. She got some thoughts out of his head. That sister, boy did she sound like a piece of work. "Korra, there was a beacon of light in the sky, something that could only be explained by the Avatar. It was said that when they were both in the same place, open your eyes, or I'll open them for you." Zuko said. Korra sighed. He meant it. Boy, did she hope the other Avatar would be better at escaping the Fire Nation than she was. At least he'd probably know they were coming. As she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the blue glow that they were emanating, glowing softly against Zuko's eyes. That soft glow disappeared almost immediately, as it was replaced by a much, much larger one that seemed to swallow the whole area of mountain in light. Well, we haven't seen an airbender until my grandson and granddaughter brought you back here. Honestly, we thought you were all extinct. An elderly woman, Sokka and Katara's grandmother, said. Aang sat stunned for a moment as he took in that information. Extinct? Aang asked, the word tasting bad in his mouth. He tried to push the thought down, but it stuck in his throat. They were wrong, they had to be. As he opened his mouth to speak again, something caught his eye. A beam of light coming from beyond the sea. Almost immediately, Aang began to float, to glow like Katara and Sokka had thought they'd seen when he emerged from the ice, as a beam of light exploded from him in response. It only lasted a few moments, but it was enough to catch the attention of everyone in the Southern Water Tribe. As Aang stepped back down to the ground, both lights faded. Aang looked like he had just woken from a long sleep. Do you know what you just found? Gran looked toward the eyes of Sokka and Katara, while never taking her eyes off Aang. The Avatar. Sokka and Katara shared a look of sheer concern that radiated through their faces. And that other light, does that mean, Sokka asked, the other Avatar? They have arrived, their grandmother replied, but there was something else there, something far more concerning. Ash is filling the sky, their grandmother whispered. Sokka and Katara looked at each other. Whoever the other Avatar was, they were already captured by the Fire Nation. What chance could Aang have? The fight had lasted a very short time. It was clear to Aang that those in the village wouldn't stand a chance against a prolonged military conflict. They were so peaceful. So he did what any Avatar should do. He protected them. It surprised him how gentle his captors were. He expected the prince to blow up in his face, but he didn't. He just passed him away to the soldiers and left. He could see conflict in his eyes as he watched the waving leaves fade away. He was led to a dinghy near where he gathered at the bottom of the ship. The fight had lasted a very short time. It was clear to Aang that those in the village wouldn't stand a chance in a prolonged military conflict. They were peaceful, so he did what an Avatar should do. He protected them. It surprised him how relatively gentle his captors were. He expected the prince to blow up in his face, but he didn't. He just passed him away to the soldiers and left. He could see conflict in Zuko's eyes. Aang was led to a dingy area where he gathered the bottom of the ship was. Near a young woman. He was led into her room, in fact. He almost immediately felt connected to her. When he was training at the air temple, he was told that this could be how it was. The Avatar wasn't one person. They always came in pairs, the last of which being Roku and Kyoshi. In the writings he studied, the limited reading he'd done, Roku described it as a siblinghood of sorts. Like he knew that she was the Avatar the second he laid eyes on her. Are you? Aang stuttered as he looked at the girl's face. Her eyes met his almost immediately. The joking stoic look on it faded as an almost curious one took hold. The two of them felt the other half of their souls in each other. Oh, crud, Korra muttered to herself. She was hoping at the very least the other Avatar would be a bit older than her, someone a bit more responsible, or if it wasn't, that she would at least be able to adopt her regular attitude upon meeting the guy. That way she'd be able to operate independently still. It was definitely quicker that way. Granted, she didn't exactly care about the kid in front of her. It wasn't like she was fawning over him or anything, she just met him, but she knew he was important. It was like seeing a brother that she had never met. A single glance told her that. Just one glance. Some Avatars had bonds that grew much deeper than that. Roku described Kyoshi as his sister in everything but blood. Heck, in what few drawings and statues of them that the Fire Nation hadn't torn apart and buried, they were always depicted as together, inseparable. Others couldn't stand each other. It was a coin flip, and one that she was about to have to take. She had just found her other half after all. There was no changing that. He looked up at her, a look in his eye that asked her a question. A simple sentence that she could practically hear despite him never saying a word. Are you with me? He was planning on escaping. Of course he was. She was initially too. She probably could have left like 5 times by now from her recollection. While Zuko was dangerous, the rest of his guards weren't. But she wanted to save the prince, to snap him out of his self-destructive spiral. She figured with enough time, especially since he would need to find the other avatar before he could turn her in, she could probably do it. And if she could help him, maybe, just maybe, she could drop a bit of sense into the Fire Nation. She could help put a stop to a war that had dragged on for 100 years. But with both halves of the Avatar in his possession, he definitely wasn't going to wait any longer, so that plan was firmly out the window. Even if it wasn't, even if she was absolutely sure that she could convince Zuko by the time they got to the Fire Nation, which she probably couldn't do, even with the headway she managed to get so far, she wasn't willing to put the boy in front of her in danger to be stuck in here. So, she nodded. Almost instantly, Aang shot out a jet of high-pressure air from his lungs, bashing himself and the guard holding him into a wall. Korra forced her shock to subside immediately, but it was there, for a split second. An airbender. An honest-to-spirits airbender. She was liking this kid more and more. When another guard tried to attack Aang, raising his blade in a pouncing position, Korra let out a roar, a plume of fire leaving her mouth. The Fire Nation didn't fight firebenders. Their suits were rarely, if ever, prepared for it. True to form, it began glowing red-hot, searing against the man's skin as he yelled out in pain. She silently thanked the spirits that even though she was only a novice firebender, she could still burn bright. Aang jumped up, kicking the man in the face as he fell to the ground. He landed in front of Korra, trying his hand at a reassuring smile. "Hi, I'm Aang. I'm the Avatar." The girl almost burst out laughing, but settled for a small chuckle at the boy. He was earnest. It was pretty unheard of, honestly. "Well, I kinda figured, kid. Hi, I'm Korra. I'm the Avatar too." Introductions aside, she pushed Aang with her foot, forcing him to spin around as she shot a short burst of fire from her mouth at his restraints, which crumbled to ash. Aang, without missing a beat, used his airbending to cut the chains that bound her to the wall. Standing up, she smiled. "So, airbender. I have maybe a million questions about that, but there's no way they didn't hear the commotion. I'm hoping you have an escape plan to get out of here, wherever here is." "Nope," Aang said guiltily. Korra sighed. The kid was naive, almost cute. He was maybe a year younger than her, but man, he really seemed like a child. "Alright then," Korra muttered as she grabbed Aang's hand. "We'll figure it out as we go." She had already started running when the sentence was finished. The resistance they met on the way to the top of the ship was, well, it was nothing. It was less than nothing to the pair of them. Korra's firebending was paltry compared to theirs, but she was able to catch them by surprise enough to actually use it. Something about not being any real combat for a century probably dulled the shellhead's senses. That was what happened when you won for too long. That, combined with the incredibly adept airbending that Aang displayed, something that Korra really wasn't expecting from someone as innocent-looking as he was, and the whole thing was a snap. Until it wasn't. "The Avatars have escaped!" That one shout was going to make their job so much harder. That was why Korra was going to try and sneak out when she left. They might have not been the best fighters, but if enough of them gathered, it wouldn't matter. And someone really competent like Zuko showing up, things were going to turn into a mess very quickly. "Follow me!" Aang shouted as he ran. It was the direction he was running, though, that confused her. Back into the ships. It wasn't like they had infinite options. There were less people back that way. More people were gathering to the top to try and stop them. So it unfortunately was probably the best option. She cursed, doing what she was told. Twisting down the metal corridors, Aang took down one person while Korra took down another. One to the left, one to the right, one behind. Shellheads were getting more frequent. Soon they wouldn't be able to fight them off. Korra pushed one of the doors open, as Aang knocked out another guard. If they could barricade themselves for a second, they might be able to catch their... Hi, Korra said, inwardly screaming, as she took in the shocked form of Zuko staring at the two of them. And she cursed all of the choices she had ever made in her life. Of course this was his room. Of course it was. Just her luck. Zuko watched the pair of them for a moment before launching a fire blast that Aang dispelled with his own air blast. Aang pushed him back into the room with a large blast of air again, as Korra shut the door, attempting to seal it with a concentrated flame blast. And just like that, she sailed off an unfortunately promising room. People coming in from the left and right now. A lot of people. Easily 30 by her count. This time it was Aang grabbing her hand, leading her away as quickly as possible. Through the twists and turns, she could tell where he was taking her, back to the top. Now that so many people were chasing them to the lower decks, the upper ones were probably safe. It was a smart move. A really smart one. Another point for the air nomad, she said to herself. It was shockingly good timing. She heard an explosion that would have been Zuko being freed. With his determination, he'd be on them in seconds. As they reached the top, Aang immediately lunged for a staff that had been leaning on the ship's rail. His weapon, if Korra had to guess. The second he managed to grab it, Zuko burst through the sealed doors. You aren't getting away from me, he snarled as he rushed them. He went for Aang first. It was pretty clear the boy was outmatched by someone who had spent his life fighting. As Aang barely dodged a flaming fist from Zuko, Korra pulled him away, as the pair retreated to the front of the ship. Zuko now had the entire fleet behind him, what was left of them that the Avatars hadn't knocked out anyway. As Korra looked overboard, she looked at Aang. This time it was her turn to ask for his trust. He nodded as Korra turned back to Zuko. Look, we're getting away from the ship. You'll just have to deal with it. She smiled as Zuko stepped closer, her hand clutching Aang's, so tight that she wouldn't be able to lose him in this attempt. Or, you could come with us. She ignored the look from Aang that basically screamed that she was crazy. Zuko's fist clenched even tighter, but no flames came forth. He was hesitating to fight them. So, she had gotten through to him a little bit. You think I'll just abandon my people? My honor? My father? Oh, your father. Your father who sent you on a mission that literally should have been impossible? Your sister who from your descriptions might be even worse? What are you even fighting for? Korra shouted. I need to go home. Home is the people around you. Are those people really your home? Korra asked. She saw that Iroh, Zuko's uncle, now stood beside him. From the look in his eye, he agreed with her, but he wasn't going to say it. Korra reached out a hand to Zuko. All you gotta do is take one step, and I'll be a traitor, Zuko spat. Yeah, you will be, and it seems a heck of a lot better than being a prince, she argued. Zuko looked between her and Aang. For a second, he almost seemed to lower his hands, but it only lasted a second. Zuko looked to his surrounding officers, people who were sworn to follow the Prince of the Fire Nation, people who represented the honor that he wanted to reclaim, and he couldn't bring himself to give that up. He took a step all right, the beginnings of a fire blast. Immediately, Korra's hand tightened even more around Aang's as she jumped in front of him, pulling Aang off the ship with her, as she used her water bending to manage to make a wave just big enough for them to stand on. But there were too many people still on the ship from above. Korra couldn't push herself quickly holding Aang's hand. He was heavily restricting her movement. Eventually, Aang got hit in the back of the head by a fire blast. He was on the verge of passing out almost instantly, and that was it. It was the last straw. Aang's self-preservation kicked in, and so did Korra's. The part that formed between them when they first saw each other, that kicked in too. Their desire to protect each other. The next blast that came toward them was blown away in a gust of wind as the pair were lifted, a dome of water surrounding them. Through the murking seas, 4 piercing eyes could be made out. The Avatars didn't run like Zuko thought they would. Aang landed in front of the ship, a cyclone of water sweeping up almost every soldier around him, knocking Zuko against the side of the ship. Meanwhile, the seas around the ship froze, lifting it out of the water, as Korra, above the ocean, pushed the ship so far up that it wouldn't be able to gain any traction in the ocean. Aang's wrath nearly depleted, but Korra took it one step further. She used the water to punch a hole in the ship's hull as she landed on the top deck. Almost immediately after, the pair collapsed back to normal, just in time for a flying bison to land on the ship's deck. Aang! Aang, are you okay? Katara asked as she kneeled beside him, along with her brother. Hey, Sokka, Katara. Thanks for coming, Aang said, gratefulness evident in his voice. Well, I couldn't let you have all the fun, Sokka joked. Aang clutched the staff that he had thankfully managed to keep hold of through whatever just happened to him. The other Avatar, they had her. She's over there, he said weakly. Sokka's eyes widened as he looked to see a girl in Earth Kingdom clothing. Huh, I always thought she'd be from the Water Tribe, Sokka said plainly, Korra pushing past him as another fire blast soared by his head. You can feel free to ask me the sordid details of my past life later, Korra muttered, pushing the crowd on the flying bison, something she had to keep her reaction calm upon seeing. She just had to keep calm as the thing pushed into the sky. I'll ask about it later, Cora muttered to herself. It had been a few days for Ed. A long few days. Ever since people thought of him as whoever this Avatar guy was, he hadn't been able to show himself out in the open, having to hide himself just to get the basics of what he needed. Food, water, basic information on where he was. It especially didn't help that nobody around this place had blonde hair, which meant that his basic genetics were a dead giveaway. Not to mention his money was basically worthless here, and those firebender guys that everybody was so scared of started poking around town. And if those earthbenders were anything to go by, he basically had to be fighting dozens of copies of the Colonel out there. The best lead that he got was some underground fighting tournament, contest of earthbenders. Apparently the winner didn't just get money, they got enough money to be rich around here. And he could probably limit himself to just controlling Earth for a bit, hide some of his light show under his cloak. If anything, it would be a good way to get some resources, maybe stretch his legs. So, he did go, and he watched. A bunch of meatheads using rocks in frankly impossible ways to kick the crap out of each other. It might have not made sense to him, this whole bending thing, but he was beginning to understand the rules. To move the rock, you had to make yourself sturdy, jolting around in steady, sturdy motions. Almost like you had to be as hard as a rock to push one. He'd have to try to mimic this to hide his alchemy. Enjoying the show? Someone said next to him. A girl, probably around his age. And surprisingly, although he'd never admit it was surprising, she was a bit shorter than him. You're not cheering like everybody else. I try not to cheer when I'm studying, Ed said blankly. You're competing? The girl asked. Ed ignored the indignant tone as best he could. I need the money, he replied. Huh, the girl replied. Everyone around here is usually in it to be the best. Don't really care, Ed replied. And you call yourself an earthbender? The girl asked, laughing. Ed's silence at the statement was only piquing her curiosity. It seemed like, unlike everybody else here, this guy had no ego to go with his bending. That was different than she was used to. So, what do you need the money for? She asked. Getting out of this place as quickly as my legs will carry me, Ed replied, pulling his hood down ever so slightly. Out in the open like this, having his blonde hair out wasn't the best idea. Preferably his fight would only last a couple of minutes maximum. Uh-huh, and go where? She asked, her voice sounding more earnest than Ed expected. What, you want to come with? Ed joked. This time, it was him to be weirded out by her silence. Tell you what, when I beat you, you tell me where you're going, she replied, Ed tilting his head in confusion, only for the girl to casually get up and walk to the stands as the announcer called for the champion of that round, the absolute mountain of a man they called the Boulder, to face off against the undefeated champion. The blind bandit. That girl. Ed folded his face in a grin. At least this place had a few surprises. Princess Azula stepped off the boat that had carried her from her nation to this one, a nation where she was, under no circumstances, to make a scene. She knew that there was nothing here, but she had to admit, her brother's chasing of the Avatar had made her curious about these rumors. A boy seemingly able to bend every element, who had gotten into a scuffle with the Earth Kingdom Guard. If she was able to find the Avatar before her brother, it would just look even better for her. As Mai walked beside her, she was only curious about the fact that her brother seemed to show no interest in it. He would chase any shadow, which meant that this was probably something not even worth his time. Or, maybe, she thought as she straightened the attire of her peasant clothing, a disguise she wore not to attract any attention, clothing that itched her skin with every step that she took in a frankly unbearable way. Just maybe, she wasn't chasing a shadow. If anything, it would be a good enough way to pass the time. Hey everybody, thanks for checking out my first non-Earth OCU video. It's been a blast to work on and record. And this is probably going to be my only non-OCU video for a minute, but I will be continuing to work on it so it will receive updates just like everything else. But, you know, Earth OCU is going to continue to be my primary priority. Which means I'm going to get to see you guys next time real soon for the next episode of Earth OCU, which I intend on being a continuation of Omni Falls. Until next time, I've been your captain, and it's been a pleasure taking you on another tour of the strongest Earth in the multiverse. See ya!